1908, one observer from here, from New Britain, noted with flourish that on the days of national commemorations, and I quote, "In the shade of the past glory of our fathers, we allow those exhausted by the struggle for the national being to rest. We refresh and strengthen ourselves with memories of greatness of the days past, and we draw from them the new strength, fortitude of spirit and will, so that with this new energy we can go ahead into our constant struggle, final struggle, whose end unfortunately is still not near, a struggle for our national existence." We'll see whether, yeah, it cooperates, good. What Polonia leaders engaged in at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries was a process which Eric Hobsbawm termed inventing of traditions. According to Hobsbawm, national commemorations were part of invented traditions, which he defined as a set of practices normally governed by overtly or tacitly accepted rules and of a ritual of symbolic nature which seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behavior by repetition, which automatically implies continuity with the past. In fact, where possible, they normally attempt to establish continuity with a suitable historic past. This, of course, begs a question, what on earth is suitable historic past? What's the difference between the past and suitable historic past? And we're going to try to answer this question as we go along. Well, this continuity with the past might be, as Hobsbawm reminds us, largely fictitious, thus he calls that invented. And yet the invented traditions should not be underestimated. They are important since they are responses to novel situations which take the form of reference to old situations, says Hobsbawm, and in the context of the rapidly changing world, they attempt to structure at least some parts of social life within it as unchanging and invariant. According to Hobsbawm, Europe mass-produced traditions with particular intensity in the period from about 1870 to 1914. Studying mainly Western Europe, Hobsbawm identified the state, social elites, and the civil society as the main agents in the process of inventing traditions, such as, for example, the Bastille Day, which was celebrated in France since 1880, or anniversaries of the Franco-Prussian War celebrated in Germany around the same time. A similar process also took place in the United States, where the diverse society was expected to accept and participate in the rituals commemorating the common historical experience of the nation, celebrating, for example, the 4th of July and Thanksgiving Day. These are, according to Hobsbawm and others, the examples of invented traditions. Now, historians of immigration and ethnicity point out that at the same time when the concept of the American nation was being constructed, American immigrant groups often established their own invented traditions, such as, and we have some good pictures here, St. Patrick's Day for the Irish or Columbus Day for the Italians. The last few decades of the long 19th century in partitioned Poland could not, of course, feature either the Polish state or any unified political class as the institutional actors behind the invention of tradition. Yet, according to the groundbreaking work of historian Patrice Dąbrowski, national commemorations played an important cultural role in the building and maintenance of national consciousness, especially following the devastating January uprising in the Russian partition in 1863-64. In the second half of the 19th century, political conditions both in the Russian and German partitions were not at all conducive to any patriotic manifestations, as the authorities there adopted harsh and systematic denationalization policies. In Galicia, the third partition, the most liberal of those partitions, the organization of the national commemorations was complicated enough, but nevertheless provided an opportunity for celebrations which were very carefully thought out and tacitly directed towards the idea of future Poland, independent, united, and democratic. In most cases, the main actors behind the ideas of commemorations were intellectual, cultural, and political leaders who found their audience and gradually also participants in the masses of the Polish society, including the peasantry. Even after Poland had regained independence in 1918, the process of invention of traditions not only did not cease, but rather, as Professor Biskupski himself argues, continued vigorously, especially in case of the November 11 Independence Day, whose celebrations became politically contentious, both during the interwar period and in the aftermath of World War II in Poland. But going back to Polonia. The first record of Polonia's public commemorations in America comes from the era preceding mass immigration, when Polish political emigres organized in New York in 1844 an event remembering the 14th anniversary of the November Uprising. The gala was attended by representatives of various immigrant groups, including Italians, Germans, and Scandinavians, as well as the American press and politics. 10 years later, another November Uprising commemoration ceremony in New York gathered again the exiled leaders of various nationalities and a sizable group of American politicians, writers, publishers, and editors, and other prominent figures of public life. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, Gmina Polska, the Polish Commune, an early secular democratic organization established in Chicago in 1866, so we're talking about the times after the Civil War already, organized annual observances commemorating the November and the January uprisings in order to remind about, and I quote, the bloody protest against the violence of the bloodthirsty despots, and to awaken and strengthen the national spirit among the local Polish people on the foreign soil. The 3rd of May Constitution was also honored, establishing this way the early foundation for what I argue is the Polonia's canon of national celebrations. And again, we're going to talk about it a little bit more later. The last 3 decades of the 19th century witnessed an intense competition for leadership within Polonia between the two dominant fraternal organizations, the Polish National Alliance, or PNA, established in 1880, and the Polish Roman Catholic Union, or PRCU, established in 1873. The two organizations used the celebration as an open stage on which to present and justify their respective ideologies. While they rarely disagreed what should be celebrated, the PNA and the PRCU had often conflicting views on how it should be celebrated. As a consequence, some obchody were celebrated jointly, emphasizing the unity within Polonia, while others were organized separately, indicating deep ideological divisions within the community. For example, as historian Stanisław Osada reminds us, the opening salvo in the ideological hostilities between the two camps had been fired during the celebrations of the November Uprising in 1873, sponsored then by Gmina Polska and described in detail in Gazeta Polska, Polish Gazette. The celebration began with a solemn requiem mass in St. Stanislaus Kostka Church in Chicago, and continued with speeches by community leaders and clergymen during the civil ceremony in a rented hall. There, Reverend Zwiardowski, who already in church emphasized the need to clearly define the immigrant organizations as Catholic first, stated that not lud, the people, as the Gmina Polska banner proclaimed, but cud, a miracle, or a divine intervention brought on by sincere prayers, would bring the salvation of Poland from oppression and its freedom. In his response, an activist and publisher, Władysław Dyniewicz, retorted that the prayer without deeds was a dead letter, while the chairman of the obchód closed the celebrations by reminding that although Poland never forgot about God and prayer, it also never condemned other religions and traditionally showed religious tolerance. So there we had it. However, on the other hand, in 1880, the 50th anniversary of November insurrection, That anniversary was celebrated jointly in Chicago by the PRCU and PNA with solemn masses in St. Stanislav and St. Wojciech churches, a dinner featuring veterans of the insurrection, and a 2-hour-long parade in which Illinois Governor S.M. Cullom, Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison, and District Judge Doolittle also took part. Similar examples of Polonia sometimes coming together and sometimes drifting apart, depending on the time period and circumstances, will punctuate the entire pre-World War I period. But where did Polonia search for the usable past to celebrate? The stimulus to honor and remember came sometimes directly from Poland. For example, in 1879, Galician Poles organized in Kraków a jubilee celebrating half a century of literary work by Józef Ignacy Kraszewski, a great writer of historical novels highlighting Poland's glorious past. Kraszewski's jubilee was meant as a way to honor the person of the prolific writer in exile and supporter of the January insurrection, but first and foremost of the values he represented: devotion to the Polish language, love for Poland's history, and commitment to the education of the masses and organic work. The festivities in Kraków lasted several days and gathered representatives of all three partitions in what Patrice Dąbrowski sees as the first attempt at peaceful nation building following the failure of the January insurrection. The idea of a jubilee for Kraszewski resonated with the entire Polish diaspora. In the United States, Gmina Polska again led the efforts. According to Osada, the activists fundraised and with donated money purchased an engraved cup, which, together with a special address, was delivered to Kraszewski by a representative of Polonia during the jubilee in Kraków. Poet Teofila Samolińska composed a long ode to Kraszewski, a gift which was later acknowledged by the writer himself in a handwritten response that was displayed for all Polonia to see. Polonia organized festivities in several locations, including San Francisco and Chicago, with the participation of delegations from other Polonia centers. In 1887, when Kraszewski passed away, American Polonia again organized commemorative observances, although this time the occasion reflected deepened internal divisions within the community. While the PNA spearheaded the celebrations, the PRCU refused to celebrate, citing Kraszewski's anti-clerical tendencies, which, to be honest, were already being brought up as a serious concern during the first celebrations of Kraszewski in 1879. Again, following an example from Poland, Polonia also celebrated other Polish artists and writers. For example, poet Adam Mickiewicz. In June 1898, Mickiewicz's birthday celebrations were held in Chicago's Central Music Hall. A few years later, in 1902, the Polish Women's Alliance held a jubilee celebration for Maria Konopnicka, a beloved Polish poet who often wrote about rural poverty and the plight of children while praising the beauty of the Polish countryside. The celebrations for Kraszewski, Mickiewicz, and Konopnicka carried with them, of course, more meaning than simply honoring the towering figures of Polish literature. They were excuses to highlight patriotism, love for homeland, its language and culture, and, most importantly, hope for its people. Another good example of the inspiration coming from Poland was a lavish ceremony commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Relief of Vienna, organized in Kraków in 1883. It was to remind both the partitioned nation and the world about the history of Polish military triumph over the Turkish invaders and the victory of King Jan III Sobieski in defense of Christianity in Europe. In America, Polish immigrants also undertook the task of bringing together the two competing ideological camps to properly recognize the occasion. The Relief of Vienna, blending neatly national and religious aspects, provided just the right opportunity. Early in the year, the PNA issued a proclamation which read, "Countrymen, Maintenance and propagation of traditions related to the history and greatness of power of the Polish nation is an important task of the Polish National Alliance. We join together and unite here in America so that all the children of the torn apart Poland thrown to the other hemisphere could be joined through brotherly love. This year gives us an opportunity to show the world that Poles know, feel, and remember about their greatness and power as a nation. The PRCU supported the initiative and lent the skillful leadership of Piotr Kielbasa to serve as the marshal of the procession. So, on September 12, 1883, the exact same date when Poles gathered in Kraków, the obchód in Chicago began with simultaneous masses in the churches of St. Stanisław and St. Wojciech. An impressive parade consisting of members of the various associations and groups marched along the Chicago street to Central Music Hall, entirely stopping the traffic, as both Polish and American press reported. The platform party included both Polish leaders and American guests who gave many uplifting speeches. The hall was filled to capacity. A successful obchód was also organized in New York, where General of the Union Army, Władysław Krzyżanowski, spoke in English, and the invited guests included representatives of American, French, and Austrian press. According to Osada, similar festivities, although on a smaller scale, took place also in other locations of Polonia. The year 1891 brought an important anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the 3rd of May Constitution. The celebrations were planned in both Poland and in America. In Poland, they took place, again, in Kraków, but also Lwów, and illegally in Warsaw. In Warsaw, it wasn't legal. And then in a number of smaller localities. Because of the clear connection to the partitions, large political manifestations were, of course, impossible in Poland. So many commemorative activities focused rather on local initiatives. One would imagine that the occasion would be an opportunity to display the unity within Polonia. But sadly, that again was not the case. An attempt to collaborate on the organization of the central ceremonies in Chicago fell through after Reverend Barzyński presented conditions demanding that all Polish immigrant societies would accept only Catholics into their ranks and adopt a program similar to the PRCU religious direction. As a result, both sides sponsored separate obchody, showing only enough tact, as historian Mieczysław Hyman remarks, to schedule them on 2 different dates. Once the anniversary of the Kościuszko insurrection approached, perhaps remembering the bitter divisions caused by the 3rd of May celebrations 3 years earlier, Polonia decided to support their countrymen in Poland and to participate in the Lwów exposition, Wystawa Krajowa Powszechna, prepared in Galicia in 1894. A joint committee gathered representatives of both PNA and the PRCU and announced, I quote, "We have no industry which we could present to the astonishment of the whole world, but we do have religious, intellectual, social, and national life. Let us showcase the fruits of this life." The Polonia Pavilion inside the exhibition hall was stylized to look like a Polish-American farm. It always stunned me because majority of Polish-American immigrants actually lived in urban areas and worked in industry. Yet, like a Polish-American farm, and was filled with artifacts from Polonia life sent over from the United States. It was opened in Lwów on June 20, 1894, to the accolades of both Polish leaders and activists and the Polonia delegation itself. Since 1894 was named the Kościuszko year, numerous obchody also took place within Polonia's local communities. The next year, 1895, was announced the year of national mourning because it marked the 100th anniversary of the 3rd partition. Historian Stanisław Osada remarked that during both years, Poles in America experienced, I quote, "more intense patriotic feelings than ever before." The PRCU leadership called for special symbolic ways of honoring the national mourning by wearing black ribbons on the collar and refraining from partying and dancing. Instead, appeals were made to increase donations to the libraries, education, public lectures, and charity. In 1910, Polonia, together with the Polish nation in Poland, celebrated the 500th anniversary of the victory of the Polish and Lithuanian forces over the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. Local communities held obchody commemorating that historical event, while the PRCU and PNA leadership sent out a joint delegation to Kraków to participate in the festivities there, including the unveiling of the monument to King Władysław Jagiełło. In Chicago, the largest event took place at the White Sox ballpark, where a joint rally and parade supposedly included close to 30,000 people. So that's sizable. Polish immigrant leaders used the historic symbols drawn from Poland's past to not only awake patriotic feelings in the immigrant masses, but also to legitimize their place within the American society, with the American society as the main audience for Polonia messages. At the turn of the century, Polonia organized a number of public celebrations aimed at what Stanisław Blejwas termed politics of recognition, through which Poles intended to present their accomplishments to the American public, as well as compete with other ethnic groups for respectability. Such activities featured a number of different venues, all of them directed more outwardly. For example, organization of the Polish Day at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In 1893, erecting of monuments to Kościuszko in Chicago, 1904, Milwaukee, 1905, and to Kościuszko and Pulaski in Washington, D.C. in 1910. In order to promote and systematize both the ritual and messages for national commemorations, between 1887 and 1914, a number of handbooks were published. Some were sponsored by large national organizations, and others were written by individual authors. They provided guidelines for organization of obchody by local chapters and communities, listed and explained historical events to be commemorated, streamlined the commemoration ritual, and supplied ready-to-use speeches and poetic materials for the artistic program. These previously unknown commemoration manuals allow us to better understand the thought process behind the invention of tradition. As I indicated before, their analysis shows that regardless of their ideological leanings, Polonia leaders rather uniformly used the same historical references to advance their messages and consequently adopted common canon of national observances in Polonia, which included the anniversaries of November Uprising, January Insurrection, and the 3rd of May Constitution. There was also no disagreement about the importance and need to celebrate national anniversaries. For example, the authors of the PNA volume readily acknowledged that obchody were instrumental in the development and retention of national identity. They wrote, and I quote, "There is no doubt that it is during such commemorations that the great majority of our people in America for the first time in their lives began thinking about where they came from, that only at such commemorations they had in them awakened the feeling of belonging to the great, although filled with misfortune, Polish nation. And through that, this cement was created, which we nowadays try, with more or less luck, to use in our organizational work. Without the obchody, there would be no Polonia organizations," they continued. "If we give up for a time organization of obchody narodowe, everything that we built so far will fall apart into atoms. American Polonia will drown in the sea of Americanism," end of quotation. The authors of the PRCU handbook identified the goals of obchody as public proclamation of love for Poland. If we benefit from the merits of our ancestors, it is only right to commemorate them and to proclaim their contributions to the whole world. The more the immigrants publicly praise and propagate the glorious history of Poland to the world, the more the world will value the immigrants too, as children of the nation, powerful, famous, and meritorious in every field. The author of the Manual of New Britain's Przewodnik Katolicki, yes, Przewodnik Katolicki actually published one of those manuals, and it's a pretty obvious who was the author. I think that Father Bujnowski So przewodnik katolicki also stressed patriotic value of obchody and offered a captivating metaphor. I really like this one. I quote, "In the gray sameness of our everyday life, obchody narodowe are to us what to the traveler through the desert sands is an oasis full of greenery and fresh spring water. The national commemorations should include reflection on the reasons why Poland fell and search for ways of national healing." As far as rationalization for the choice of the historical events to commemorate, the authors of the manuals offered an interesting set of interpretations. Polonia's choice to celebrate the 3rd of May Constitution was easily justified in the American context. The entire concept of constitutionality could strongly resonate with the American public. The Polish constitution showed Poland as a country ready and able to reform, lawful, and embracing an idea of democracy. The progressive reforms proposed in the constitution made Polish Americans justifiably proud and in many ways legitimized their place within the American society. The choice of the two uprisings might be considered more curious. The January insurrection may be easier to explain. It was a generational event which affected all classes of the Polish nation. Some participants of the uprising ended up in America at the turn of the century were still active in Polonia. By the turn of the century, the attachment to the November uprising is seemingly more difficult to explain, even when we remember that the anniversaries of the event were celebrated in the Polish exile circles already before the Civil War. As the analysis of the handbook suggests, however, commemorations of both uprisings became occasions to evoke in the attendees particularly high emotions, which were to bring on the faith in the national rebirth and commitment to the idea of independence. At the same time, the history of the uprisings was used to draw rather negative historical lessons, providing reflections about what Polonia should admire but avoid. One of the collections featured, for example, a speech for the January insurrection with a particular poignant reference to the significance of commemorating what were clearly historical defeats. The authors addressed the issue directly. I quote, "One could ask us who adopted these battles as our tradition and whose history is a national gospel. Why these memories of failures, defeats, and grief, these anniversaries of painful, bloody disappointments we still celebrate so solemnly, festively, and lovingly? One could think that it would be better to avoid painful memories, which brought so much misery to the entire great nation, which confounded so much hope and wishes for the future. Why have we made these anniversaries into national celebrations publicly honored so universally and formally? It is because to us, in the defeat, there is a seed of rebirth. In the crosses rests a lesson for generations, and the hundreds and thousands of sacrifices laid on the altar of the homeland show the indestructibility and immortality of the nation." I really like the rhetoric that is connected to that. The PNA handbook, which included 4 speeches for the November uprising and 4 for the January uprising, emphasized the lessons that need to be learned. In case of the November uprising, it was the incompetence and ineptitude of leaders who were responsible for the defeat despite the sacrifice of the soldiers. In case of the January uprising, it was the lack of unity within the Polish nation and lack of national feeling among the peasantry, which could be blamed for the failure of the valiant military effort. Both of these lessons were then skillfully translated into a positive program for Polonia, choosing its leaders wisely and democratically, and remaining strong, unified, and patriotic, as well as working towards oświata, or enlightenment, of the people, which would allow them to gain better social and political awareness and better serve the homeland. The PRCU handbook likewise stressed that the armed struggle was an example of ultimate love and sacrifice, which should be acknowledged but not repeated. Instead, a concept of cicha praca, quiet work, reminiscent of the positivistic program of organic work, were exposed as more suitable historical lessons for Polonia. The uprisings were a noble attempt, but very costly, teaching Poles to never again porywać się z motyką na słońce, attack the sun with a hoe, as the Polish saying goes. Along the same lines, the author of a booklet, Pięć Mów from New Britain, stressed that instead of offering their lives in a beautiful sacrifice, Poles should rather show the love for their homeland through good work, a moral life, keeping of faith, and working together. And we're coming we're getting closer to an end. Any process of invention of tradition cannot remain stagnant. Interestingly enough, after Poland had regained its independence in 1918, celebrating failed uprisings in Polonia began to be criticized. For example, in a 1938 letter to a popular Polish language weekly, America Echo, one reader recalled arguments expressed during a local PNA meeting in Chicago. According to participants of that meeting, neither November nor January uprisings should be commemorated in Polonia any longer because, and I quote, "these uprisings did not bring good results, but rather brought a fiasco to independence, and after all, no nation celebrates its downfall, but only victories." Others, however, defended the tradition of dear by painful remembrances, and for example, one reader argued, "I regard those days, although tragic and painful for us, as the most uplifting events in our history, days of noble passion and sacrifice on the altar of the fatherland." During the interwar period, the surviving programs of Polonia celebrations, and here I need to thank Renata Wykry and Ewa Wołyńska for pursuing a project of digitizing programs of various celebrations. These are all ephemeral materials, but without them we would know nothing about it, and that comes from their collection. So during the interwar period, the surviving programs of Polonia celebrations show a growing trend to combine various historical events into one commemoration. For example, a central part of the program of the 3rd of May Constitution event from 1930, organized by the PNA in Chicago, I'm not sure that it really shows very well, featured a play that the main event during the celebrations was a play Warszawianka, which is about the November uprising. So we have 3rd of May Constitution, but really the major play is about November uprising. Now, World War II and the Cold War delivered a new set of symbols and historical events, as well as a new wave of leaders and audiences for national celebrations. There were among them anniversaries of September 1st and 17th, 1939, Katyn, Monte Cassino, the Warsaw Uprising, Poznań, 1956, and a succession of anti-communist events in Poland, 1970, 80, and especially December 13th, 1981. At the same time, American Polonia began to adopt a broader American culture of ethnic heritage days, which still continue to be organized on local levels and whose historical references often become increasingly more general. Unfortunately, the limited time here does not allow for a more in-depth interpretation of all the changes and transformations in the forms of national commemorations in the more recent decades. So to conclude, in the period before World War I, the national commemorations played an important role in Polonia by proclaiming common ties to the national historical past, strengthening attachment to homeland, and calling for unity within the Polish-American community. And the choice of historical events to celebrate was the result of the search for usable past, which was often inspired by the similar process of inventing traditions taking place in Poland. As one of the authors of the manuals that I just mentioned proclaimed, and I quote, "Patriotic commemorations, if arranged in the right way, are both good and valuable because they serve as a lesson for the young and a reminder for the old. They make all remember that beyond this adopted homeland, there is, far, far away, another native homeland. And to that one, we owe our service first and foremost." Thank you.
Well, what a thoughtful presentation. Now, I would like to open the floor to questions or comments, and I would remind you that for some reason utterly beyond my comprehension, we're actually running ahead. So therefore, you are required, each one of you, to ask 3 long, rambling questions. With that in mind, questions and comments, please. Right here.
Thank you, Eva, for this question. It's actually a very good question. Both of the organizations that I mentioned here. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Both of the organizations that I mentioned here, which is PNA, Polish National Alliance, and Polish Roman Catholic Union, promoted certain kind of Polishness. In addition to those 2 ideologies, and I'm going to go back to it in a second, other intellectuals, leaders, elites in Polonia also tried to help immigrant masses answer the question Polish, but what kind of Polish? And you're absolutely right that a lot of immigrants that arrived in the United States in the 1870s, 80s, and even 90s came with mostly local ethnic identity. It wasn't unique to just Polish immigrants. For example, Irish immigrants very often after arriving in the United States identified themselves as, for example, Corkonians, right, from County Cork. And only while being in the United States understood in a broader way that they were Irish. The same thing happens with Poles. They often characterize themselves as, for example, Galicians, or those coming from the Prussian partition, or the Russian Poles, and so on and so on. So it was really important to define that Polishness somehow. So first of all, one national existence, and thus references to great national events in Polish history. Some of the manuals have calendars saying in January you can celebrate, let's say, 7 different things, birthdays of kings, that you could celebrate every single day if you wanted to. But that the most important ones were the generational events that were turning points in Poland's history in the 19th century and the end of the 18th century. The 3 that I kept mentioning. I think that it's also important that the same thing is happening also in Poland. I on purpose included paintings by Jan Matejko, who also tries to tie Poles living under 3 partitions to the common national past by creating, for example, the paintings of the most victorious and most glorious events in Polish history. I don't know whether I
was also thinking about, in terms of national characteristics, what was promoted? Are we to be, Polish Americans should follow the image of Poles being chivalrous, glorious in battlefields, or
okay.
and that's working here with the American values, promoting solid work, I don't know, business acumen, that kind of, how that's translated.
I think that the biggest accent was on religious loyalty on faith, because Polish Roman Catholic Union says very clearly Polak Catholic. So first of all, you need to be Catholic, you need to be included in the organization of parishes that practically structured the Polonia communities in the United States, and then you're also Polish. Polish National Alliance reverses that and says you can be Polish of whatever faith, and that is one of the frictions. That's how that friction was generated. I'm not quite sure that beyond that any national traits were necessarily promoted. As I said, the manuals say admire the romantic battles of the uprisings, but don't repeat them. Work, be faithful, be unified, be democratic. So in some ways, these are the traits that the American society would recognize and support. Thank you.
However, speak too far from the microphone. And besides that, there is this screen which is it's impossible to read for people who read cataracts because the sound right side is so bright that you cannot read anything except thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but if he is the first European who visited, we should help him to be known. And maybe Italians may be a little cross with that, but we can tell them we also went to have Copernicus to study in Padua and have Italian language of Polish television, which in Italy there is no Polish program at all. So in any case, I think the historian of non-Polish origin would find out that there was a Skolna Jan, and he happened to be Polish, although he was working for the King of Denmark or Sweden. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Yes.
One more question. I think the screen got turned 45 degrees away from the sun in my house. Here, if that's not your trouble, I think that would work. But my question is, after, in your very end of your report, you mentioned, and I didn't catch it, you mentioned Monte Cassino and something else, and I didn't catch it. What it was.
I mentioned, I'm sorry. I mentioned September 1st and September 17th, 1939, Katyń, Monte Cassino, the Warsaw Uprising, Poznań, 1956, and then 1970, 1980, and December 13th, 1981.
Yes, sir.
I really have no opinion about this screen. I enjoyed the challenge. In terms of the selection that these committees made of these events, were there others that were considered and rejected? That's part one. And then part two, you make a good case for the suitability. Were they considered suitable for their selection, or were then the exercise of public performance and celebration in turn made them suitable?
I think they were considered suitable. or the opinion was divided about it, as in case of Kraszewski and celebrations after his death. First, the celebrations of Kraszewski are embraced by both ideological camps. After a few years, Kraszewski is persona non grata for PRCU because of his anti-clericalism, which itself is kind of controversial. It's not that clear. So I think that there was a lot of negotiation going on. There was negotiation going on between Polonia history and Poland's history, between what was happening in Poland and what was happening in Polonia, and first and foremost among leadership of Polonia itself, and how those different celebrations fit those ideological programs of any given organization.
Further questions or comments, please? Yes, ma'am.
How much appeal do organizations such as the PNA have to Polish immigrants coming in the past 25 years?
I think that not only 25 years, but I would say since about 1960s, the membership in fraternal organizations across the board has been falling in Polonia. The membership in professional organizations and new organizations has been growing at the same time, but what's growing the most, if we look at statistics, is lack of membership, those that are not affiliated with any organization. I think that what attracted founders of organizations like PNA or PRCU was the provision of insurance. These were mutual aid societies, right? You could have insurance. Right now, people get insurance in different ways. And the second, the cultural activities, among them celebrations that could be organized in different communities. Again, those can be organized by organizations that are not fraternals necessarily. And a lot of those activities and information and kind of interaction nowadays can be done through social media, for example. So I'm afraid that the attraction of fraternal societies in Polonia will continue its kind of downward spiral.
If I might intrude a question here, because this fascinates me. I agree, obviously, the evidence is that membership in Polonian societies is dropping. But in a way, isn't that a reflection of larger features in America, like the Lions Club, the Rotary? They're all dropping, too. Mm-hmm. What that means, I have no idea. Yes, ma'am.
Well, we're talking about the Polonias and the Polonia that came and brought their traditions with them, and I'm going more of a family sort of level. But what we need to do as Poles is to educate non-Poles about what we were and what we have accomplished and what we have offered for civilization. And people do not know. It's very sad that they do not know. I mean, you talk about Jamestown. You know, we all know about it, but does the rest of the Americans? And I think that should be our goal, is to try to educate non-Poles about our traditions and our history and everything else that we do that we think is wonderful, and we wish that they would support us.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that people who came up with those commemorations before World War I felt it very strongly. Actually, in one of those manuals, in PNA manual, there is a clear distinction between obchody narodowe and manifestacje narodowe. So national celebrations and national manifestations. And according to the authors of that manual, they say obchody narodowe should be turned inwards to let people feel Polish, while manifestacje narodowe should be representing the Polish history to the outside. And this is when officials, press, American society should be, politicians should be invited to. That's also the movement of, in some way, marking the space of American cities with place names, monuments, commemorative landmarks, and so on and so on. So something for others to note, to learn about. That is all part of national commemorations.
Mr. Pease.
Yeah, a question that actually sort of follows up on that, the idea of perhaps reaching outside the community. All the examples that you mentioned have to do with Polish occasions that speak to Poles and meetings for Poles, and that's fine. But before World War I, were there occasions or were there attempts made to perhaps make common cause with non-Polish peoples from Central Europe or immigrants, whether Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, might have felt themselves to be in a similar situation in Europe, facing the same issues as peoples subject to the Habsburg Empire, for instance.
Yes, absolutely. Especially before the Civil War, the early commemorations were organized by exiles, 48ers, for example, from the Springtime of Nations, that represented many different nationalities in Europe, from Germans through Norwegians, French, and so on. And they supported each other, and there was a real community of those political exiles. American press and American politicians did pay attention to those gatherings and were present usually at those gatherings. Later on, practically every single larger celebration included representatives of, for example, Hungarians, and also political exiles from some other Central European nations. So actually there is quite a bit of that going on. In the 1870s, Italians also are part of those celebrations. As far as going further outside, Columbian Exposition featured a Polish day and a Polish exhibit. Actually, it's a very good question because that exposition was very different than what Poles decided to show during the Wystawa Krajowa in Lwów, and it's happening almost at the same time. So one of the aspects that should be researched is how Poles chose to represent themselves to their countrymen in Lwów at the same time as they were presenting themselves to the United States during the exposition in America. We don't have that study, but I think it would be really interesting to see.
Other questions or comments, please? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned in your talk that after Poland regained independence, there was a sentiment among these parts of Polonia not to celebrate the negative uprising. Was there any effort to celebrate the two successful uprisings, the Wielkopolska uprising and the Silesian uprising? Was there any effort?
Not that I know of. No. I think that the celebration in the 1920s, 1930s, and then it continues and even intensifies, is a celebration of Polish culture in general. I think that Polonia goes kind of steps aside from celebrating particular historical events and rather celebrates in general 1,000 years of Polish history, Polish millennium, and so on, and various historical figures or accents are being woven into those much more general celebrations. So I think we're done celebrating those particular moments in the 1930s. It's all over. Mm-hmm.
Is there another question or comment, please? In which case, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Thank you so much.